Welcome to BeFrightened. We tell stories that will keep you up or help you sleep at night. I was staying at my sister's new house in the quiet neighborhood of Alameda, just outside of Portland, Oregon, while she was away on a business trip. She had just moved to the area, and her house was a lot nicer than my apartment, so I was happy to help out. The neighborhood was known for its peaceful streets and well-kept lawns, making it a popular spot for young professionals. My sister's house was cozy, with a small garden in the backyard and a driveway where she parked her car. I didn't have much to do besides keep an eye on the place and make sure her pet cat was fed. The first few days went by smoothly. It almost felt like a mini vacation, until I noticed my sister's cat had gone missing, which started to unsettle me. I spent lots of time searching around the house and the neighborhood, calling out for the cat, but there was no sign of her anywhere. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my phone on a local Facebook page for missing pets, hoping someone might have seen the cat, when I heard a strange scraping sound coming from outside. It was faint, but it sounded like something metal was being dragged along the side of the house. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I immediately got up and turned on the outdoor lights. I walked over to the window and cautiously peered outside. The yard was empty, but when I stepped out to check, I noticed strange marks on the siding, like someone had dragged a metal tool along it. The thought of someone lurking outside made me feel uneasy, but I convinced myself it was probably just some kids messing around. The next morning, I noticed something even more unsettling. My sister's cat, who had been missing for a couple of days, was lying in the backyard. But something was wrong. The poor thing wasn't moving. I rushed over, hoping it was just asleep, but as I got closer, I realized the cat was dead. There were signs that it hadn't died of natural causes. I don't want to go into the specifics. They were way too gruesome. It was just lying there, like someone had placed it on purpose. The discovery made me feel sick with anger. I started to wonder if the strange noises the night before were connected to this. Alameda was supposed to be safe, so this made me even more paranoid. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard footsteps outside. They were slow and steady, moving around outside the house. My heart raced as I listened, trying to figure out where the person was. Then I heard a loud crash, the sound of glass shattering. I ran to the window and saw a masked figure standing in the driveway, holding a crowbar. The person had turned their attention to my sister's car. I watched in horror as the intruder began smashing the car's windows, headlights, and body with the crowbar. The noise of smashing metal and glass filled the air, and I stood there, too terrified to move. The intruder seemed completely focused on the car, as if they had a vendetta against it. After what felt like an eternity, they finally stopped, dropped the crowbar, and ran off down the road, yelling and screaming like a lunatic. I had called the police as soon as I saw the intruder smashing the car. It was the second time that day that I had to call them, and they arrived quickly. But by then, the damage was already done, and the intruder was gone. My sister's car was a complete wreck. Every window had been shattered, the body dented, and the headlights smashed. The police took my statement and suggested it might have been targeted vandalism, but they couldn't say for sure. The discovery of the dead cat that morning only made everything feel even more disturbing. My sister was devastated, first losing her pet and now facing this attack on her property. Alameda, once quiet, now felt anything but safe. We both felt violated, knowing that someone had gone out of their way to do this, and we couldn't help but wonder if it might happen again. To this day, we don't know who did it or why, and that uncertainty is the worst part. The only thing we know for sure is that whoever it was, they didn't care about being seen, and they were confident enough to destroy everything in their path. My cabin sits near the edge of a secluded lake in the Adirondack Mountains, surrounded by thick woods, with the more well-known Lake Placid just a few miles away. It's not entirely isolated, but the closest neighbor is about a mile away, so it feels pretty remote. I moved here for that sense of solitude. I was wanting a fresh start after a rough period. I'd been living there alone for a few months when this happened. It was a typical autumn weekend, and I had no particular plans. I spent most of my time watching YouTube and Netflix and tending to my garden outside. In the late afternoon, while I was sitting on the front porch, I heard something unusual. There was a faint rustling sound coming from the woods at the far end of my property. Curious, I got up from the front porch and quietly walked toward the back of my property to get a better look. As I approached, the movement caught my attention. Someone seemed to be walking through the trees, skirting the edge of my property, heading deeper into the woods. Technically, it was my land, but the direction they were coming from was strange, considering how remote my place is. I watched as the figure slowly made its way along the tree line before eventually disappearing into the forest. I wasn't immediately alarmed by someone being out there, but it was unsettling given the isolation. I continued with my day, occasionally glancing out the window to see if they'd returned, but there was nothing. Later that evening, I settled in to watch a movie in the living room. About halfway through, I began to hear footsteps. They were soft but unmistakable, crunching through the fallen leaves outside. I got up quietly and peeked out of a nearby window. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a man just a few feet from the house. After a moment of shock, I carefully looked again. He seemed completely unaware of me, moving slowly as he walked across my yard. I couldn't be sure, but he looked like the person I had seen earlier. I watched him walk all the way to the far edge of the property and disappear into the trees again. It was one of the most unnerving things I'd ever experienced, especially since he had come so close to the cabin this time. I stayed up later than usual, keeping an eye out in case he returned, and I was ready to call the police if he did. By midnight, there was no further sign of him, so I decided it was safe to go to bed. I went upstairs and fell asleep quickly. Later in the night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside. I threw on a sweater and hurried downstairs, but by the time I reached the living room, the noise had stopped. I checked every window, but saw nothing. Finally, I approached the front door and looked out through the peephole. There he was, standing in my driveway, staring up at the cabin. It sent a chill down my spine. It was as if he was contemplating his next move. I grabbed my phone and called the police, knowing it would take at least half an hour for them to arrive. When I looked out at the driveway again, he was gone. I then heard the footsteps again, this time circling around to the back of the cabin. I stood still, hoping he would just leave, but then there was a sudden loud noise from the backyard, followed by complete silence. My whole body was trembling as I waited, the quiet stretching on. When the police finally arrived, they began searching the area, calling out to see if anyone would respond. After a tense wait, I found out that he had probably disappeared into the dense woods behind the cabin. Despite their efforts, the police couldn't locate him. The entire situation left me with an unsettling feeling. It still doesn't make any sense to me. After the police left, I double-checked all the locks and barricaded myself in the bedroom, barely sleeping for the rest of the night. Every little noise made me jump. The next morning, I contacted a security company to install cameras and alarms around the property. I've never seen him since. I've been working at a small distribution center for a couple of years now. It's a pretty nondescript building, the kind you might drive by without giving a second thought. The company specializes in general consumer goods, so we move a lot of electronics, household items, and the like. I work the night shift, usually by myself, since the job mostly involves paperwork, inventory counts, shipment confirmations, and the occasional security check. It's a quiet job, which is exactly what I wanted after the issues I had with a colleague at my previous job. Well, that is a story for another day. One night, while I was updating inventory records in the back office, I heard a faint jiggling sound coming from the side entrance. It's a door that's only supposed to be used by staff, and we keep it locked at all times. Intrigued, I walked over to check it out and saw a man peering through the small window in the door. He seemed to be trying to see inside. I froze for a moment, then moved closer to the door. As soon as he saw me, he started knocking on the glass and trying the handle again. "The door's locked," I said firmly through the glass. "You need to leave. This area isn't open to the public." The man stared at me for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to gauge whether I was serious. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner of the building. It was unsettling, but I convinced myself it was just some guy who had gotten lost or was confused about where he was. Later that night, unable to shake the feeling, I called a friend who used to work security. I explained what had happened, hoping for some reassurance. He suggested it might just be some prankster messing around, trying to downplay the situation, but I could hear the concern in his voice. He mentioned that if the man returned again, that it might be worth considering leaving the premises for a while, as it wasn't worth putting my safety at risk. His words lingered with me long after we hung up. The idea of leaving my post felt wrong, but the unease I felt only deepened. After that unsettling encounter, the rest of the week passed without incident, and I started to think maybe it was just a one-time thing. But then, the following week, the man started coming back again. He tried different doors, once the main entrance, another time the loading dock door. Each time, I would tell him to leave, and each time, he would hesitate, as if considering whether to listen, before finally walking away. My unease grew with every encounter, but I didn't call the police, hoping he would eventually just stop. That was my mistake. Then, one night, things escalated. I was in the middle of filling out a shipment form when I heard a loud bang on the loading dock door. It was so forceful that the metal echoed throughout the building. My heart pounded as I approached the door. Through the small window, I saw the same man, this time looking more determined, almost angry. He was trying to force the door open. His face set in a grim expression. "This is private property. I'm calling the police," I shouted, my voice shaking slightly. The man stopped what he was doing and stared at me through the glass, his expression unreadable. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly backed away and disappeared into the darkness. I immediately called the police, explaining what had been happening over the past few nights. The next day, I told my manager everything. He pulled up the security footage, and together we watched as the man appeared on the recordings night after night. Sometimes he would just stand outside the doors. Other times he would try the handles, or simply watch the building from a distance. The police patrolled the area for the next few nights, but he never returned while they were there. Even after the patrols stopped, I couldn't help but feel that he might come back. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, jumping at every little sound. The memory of his determined expression as he tried to force his way inside still haunts me to this day. I don't know what he wanted, but I hope I never find out.